Thank you for joining us. My name is Diana Arias with the Community Technical Assistance Center at NYU's McSilver Institute, and I would like to welcome you to today's offering, Telehealth and ADHD, Helping Children and Teens to Thrive Through Virtual Sessions. We are very excited to have with us Dr. Carrie Heller, licensed psychology who specializes in the evaluation and treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and executive functioning challenges. He is also a founding partner of Heller Psychology Group based in Maryland and an assistant clinical professor of clinical psychology at George Washington University. Often blending traditional talk therapy with practical ADHD executive functioning coaching, Dr. Heller provides clients with concrete tools to help them make improvements with time management and organizational skills. He has also been conducting virtual sessions for over 10 years and practices in over 30 states. So I do see that we have a good number of folks representing different parts of the state here across New York and elsewhere. So with that, again, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to pass it along to Dr. Heller to get us started now.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to all of you guys for joining us today. I'm definitely excited to chat about ADHD and telehealth. I mean, certainly it's always important to focus on talking about how to treat kids and teens with ADHD, but I think a lot of times people don't really focus on the telehealth piece. In fact, I imagine there are a lot of times where you may think, oh, how could someone who can't sit still or can't focus well benefit from telehealth treatment? I don't know. It's a question I get sometimes, but I don't know if any of you have had that thought coming into today's presentation. But we're going to talk about how can we do this? How can we help people with ADHD to thrive through treatment in general, and especially through telehealth treatment? Okay, so what we're going to do to start is I figured we'd have a brief outline because it's always good to stay organized. Really, my goal for today or one of my goals, is to really help all of you to come away from today's session with a lot of very concrete, practical strategies that you can take away and immediately start implementing on your own. Because I think it's really important not just to get a bunch of information, but to think about how can I take this information and actually use it in my own practice. So we're definitely going to look at that as part of today. Okay, so in getting started, I definitely like to have audience participation. I think it makes it more interesting, keeps everyone more engaged. So the first question that comes up is, what are some concerns you have about using telehealth with kids who have ADHD? So go ahead and feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box, please. And thanks to everyone who's introduced themselves. Definitely helpful to have some sense of, what you guys do, where you're from, things like that. But go ahead in the chat box and share any concerns you have about using telehealth with kids who have ADHD or teens too. Okay, so we have, the ability to maintain focus, being engaged. These seem to be kind of of the people that have commented so far, that seems to be probably the most common one, is issues with distractions, staying focused, paying attention, sustaining attention, the idea of being distracted by technology. So there's definitely a lot of things that could certainly impact someone's ability to stay focused during a session with telehealth. Okay, so and again, we'll come back to talking more about some of the potential sort of issues, because at the same time we'll talk about how do we address those. So before we get too far into things, I figured I would at least just briefly mention what ADHD is. I realize that as professionals, at minimum, I imagine most of you have certainly heard of it, may have a lot of experience working with it, may have learned about it, let's say, for some sort of licensing exam, and maybe haven't focused on it very much since then. Regardless of sort of how much or little you know about ADHD, the main things to really know about it are it's a disorder that really impacts self-regulation. So the idea of being able to control attention, hyperactivity. So the idea of having a hard time sitting still, fidgeting, and impulsivity. So, doing or saying things kind of without really thinking. Obviously, if you want to get very technical, there's, certainly how the DSM-5 TR labels them in terms of combined presentation, if someone has enough issues or symptoms of inattention, as well as the hyperactivity, impulsivity, predominantly attentive presentation, if it's more of the inattention piece. One thing to keep in mind, again, this is fairly technical, but people can still have some symptoms of hyperactivity, even if they have ADHD, predominantly attentive presentation. It just means that they don't have enough clinically significant symptoms, to warrant the combined presentation diagnosis. But again, understanding more about the disorder itself rather than the terminology, is far more important. Okay, the other big thing before we get too far into things is to really think about what is executive functioning. It's interesting because a lot of people talk about it. I feel in the last maybe, I don't know, 5, 10 years, I feel like suddenly it's like the term has sort of exploded in terms of its use. I mean, you have certainly executive function coaches. I feel like, at least I don't know, I see the term almost everywhere these days. But what's fascinating is a lot of times people don't take an opportunity to step back and try to define what it actually is. Part of that issue is that there's no one central definition of executive functioning. If you look up definitions, there's some general sense, but the exact skill sets involved are not always identical based on the definition you look at. So for any of you who are psychologists who do testing, the way that I broke down executive functioning skills in the slide may look a little bit familiar. So the reason for that is it's based on a self, parent, and teacher report called the Brief 2, the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function, second edition. I like how they organize the executive function skills. So that's why I kind of use that organization to illustrate this. So if we look at executive functioning, I mean, in general, as an umbrella term, it's really a bunch of different skill sets that you put together that are really needed to complete a task. Even if you think about something that in some ways may seem simple, as think about what the steps you had to take to log on to the presentation today. So you had to either maybe remember that you had the presentation, perhaps consult your calendar, and then you had to figure out either maybe you saved the link in the calendar, so you had to click it and to open it up. Maybe you had to go hunting through your email to think, hold in your mind, I know I have this presentation. What was the name of that person who sent me that link? However you figured out getting here, ultimately, you remembered the other presentation, you took the steps to log into your computer or to get the link, and then log on. So the point is, even something that may seem fairly simple requires executive function skills. Obviously, there are far more complex things in life that people have to do that require even better executive functioning. So as far as behavioral regulation goes, this looks at the idea of, so inhibition is the idea of stopping yourself from acting on doing something that you shouldn't. So the idea is, for some people, the idea of, here's a consequence, may be enough for them to think, oh, I probably shouldn't hit this button, or I probably shouldn't say this thing. But when people have a hard time with kind of stopping themselves from doing those things, they may not think about it and just act or say something. There's also the self-awareness, where the idea that sometimes people lack the self-awareness to recognize, oh, I shouldn't do this or I shouldn't say this, and then suddenly they're very surprised by someone's really negative reaction to something they said or did. With emotion regulation, I mean, part of this is what you probably would typically think about in terms of someone who has a hard time managing their emotions. So someone who gets upset or frustrated very easily. Another piece of this that really doesn't get talked about as much that's really crucial is the idea of shifting attention. So what happens with someone who has ADHD, in a lot of cases, they can have a hard time shifting their attention. So kind of transitioning from one thing to the next, and so they get stuck. And for some people, that can also, in some ways, make it harder to manage emotion. The idea that they may get frustrated very easily. So think about a child who, I don't know, they're in the middle of playing a video game and their parents say, it's time to stop. You have to get off. It's not just the fact that they have to get off that may be upsetting to them, but the idea that they have to sort of shift from focusing on the video game to whatever the next task is. And so that having to go from one thing next can lead to getting stuck. Cognitive regulation is probably the more typical things you might think about with executive function. So in terms of getting started, planning, breaking down tasks into parts, using your memory skills, holding information in your mind in order to sort of complete a task. And again, I mean, certainly you can look more on the slides, and obviously there's lots of information as well. I don't want to dwell too much on executive functioning, but in terms of definitions, I want to get to other stuff. But again, it's definitely really important to understand. Okay, so if we think about some of the benefits of the use of telehealth. So here are some ones, at least probably non-exhaustive list, but see, these are probably some of the main ones I see often in practice and in general, that certainly there's no travel time. So for a child or teen, they don't have to worry about, taking 45 minutes by car or subway to get to the appointment. Basically, they can log on, especially if they're busy with homework, they lose less time doing homework for appointments. For parents, it can be easier if, they're not home, if the kid's old enough to log on themselves, they don't necessarily have to have a parent there. And so it makes it easier. Parents don't have to worry about trying to, get out of work to get their kid to an appointment. So there's definitely some benefits around that. I mean, in terms of like a clinical perspective, certainly there can be a lot of benefits. And, for those of you that do telehealth a fair amount, you can probably relate to the idea of, you certainly see a lot, you certainly can often see a lot about what happens in someone's own environment. So even just like natural interactions that sometimes occur during sessions, it gives you a different sense of things, I think, than sometimes the way a child might or teen might report it if you're just in your office and you're talking to them. I think it can also be really helpful. I mean, one of the things that I've found most helpful with video sessions is the idea that you can actually work on stuff with people in their own environment. So if we're setting up the desk area to keep organized, or setting up a homework plan, or getting unstuck on an assignment, basically we're doing it in their own environment in the same place they'd be doing those things on their own. So it can make it a little bit easier sometimes to translate those strategies into actually executing them at home because they're already home. Okay, so in terms of some drawbacks, so again, I think I appreciate everyone that participated, a few minutes ago and shared. I think you guys probably covered, I think, most of these, but certainly, there can be concerns around, increased, screen time, temptations to do other things during sessions, concerns around focus, and limited privacy. I think the privacy one is one where, as long as you can figure out a way to make that work, that's sort of fixable, or in some ways. The others are also, this increased screen time, other than getting them to not use the screen as much otherwise, is a little harder to address. But the temptation to do other things during sessions and possible concerns about focus, those are both things that you can work through in sessions and can actually be really helpful in learning certain strategies and working on those things and using it kind of as a here and now moment. Okay, so a big question that I often think about is, in terms of the drawbacks I just mentioned, I guess how many of these could also be true if the session took place in person? So, for example, having a hard time staying focused, temptation to do other things. I don't know if any of you have worked with kids even in person where, I don't know, they don't really want to talk, so they pull out their phone. Or they, I don't know, turn away and refuse to talk. So feel free to use the chat box. Share any thoughts you have on how many of these, could be a big issue in person as well. You can either state specific ones, you can give general ideas, you can say how many of the ones I mentioned you think would be relevant in person also. But I think it's important just to think about this. Okay, so I appreciate everyone that's sharing in the chat box. So again, I think the phone distractions, again, these things, not want to talk, again, these things can all occur, for the most part, in person and in virtual. I think that's just a really important thing to think about, as part of this. Okay, so one of the things when we're thinking about whether or not to use telehealth with a client is to figure out if they're a really appropriate person to use it with. So on a practical level, does the child or teen have access to an electronic device with a microphone and camera? Obviously, if they don't have those things, you can't really do a telehealth session with them. Certainly, most devices these days, whether it's a school Chromebook or, a tablet of some kind or a smartphone, usually have a microphone and camera. Not always, and some, certainly if people have the means to be able to do it, you can also sometimes buy external, cameras and plug them in if needed. But obviously, you want to make sure they have an actual device they can use. Having sufficient privacy is really important. And so that is one thing that is definitely a big consideration. Certainly, using headphones and a mic can help to some degree with privacy, but obviously someone could still overhear, what they're saying. So that's where, using a noise machine could be helpful. And you can actually even, there are apps you can use to run essentially the equivalent of a noise machine to, provide a little bit further in terms of privacy. Again, the idea also of figuring out, can the child stay, engaged enough to make the appointment worthwhile? And then thinking about it, would it likely be very different in person? For some kids, especially younger ones, under, let's say, 6 or 7, certainly there's a decent chance that, if you're playing games with someone, it may be a little bit easier to connect, sort of, if not a lot easier in person, but not always. Certainly for older kids and teens, it may be, certainly if there's other things besides ADHD, if there's a lot of social anxiety, they may feel far more comfortable online, or they may be able to stay engaged enough, especially if you're doing stuff that's interactive during the session. On a practical level, the other thing to look at would be, are in-person options even available? If someone lives in a more remote area, or there are no therapists in the area that have openings after school in person, then telehealth gives you far more flexibility. But I think the point here is that in some cases, telehealth is used because that's the only option available, and other times it's used because it becomes a better alternative to in-person treatment for a certain person. But it depends on the individual case, and that's why looking at things about a person will help you to decide if telehealth is appropriate for a particular person. Okay. So this will start to get at. I know a couple people have posted in the chat about kids kind of turning off the camera and audio. Obviously, that happens. Sometimes it's during the first session. Other times, we're working with them for a while, and suddenly they feel like, oh, I don't want to talk anymore, and they do that. Again, I mean, in some ways, I don't know if anyone's had this experience of a kid refusing to come in from the waiting room or locking themselves in the bathroom. On occasion, I've certainly, over the years, had kids that have done that. But the point is that I think kids can find ways to disconnect from a session, whether it's in person or virtual. But in terms of keeping kids, and also yourself engaged during sessions, a couple of general ideas. So certainly, I mean, if you have a child or teen who can, sit and talk and, talk the whole time, stay really engaged, that's great. A lot of kids really can't do that though. So having a lot of interactive activities can really help, keep kids engaged during sessions. And we'll talk about some ideas for that in a minute. The other thing is also the idea of if you're going to do activities, have different things throughout the session. Don't just have a plan of, oh, I'm going to do this one activity the whole time. Because, within a short attention span, if you're doing, let's say, a 45-minute session, you probably want to have at least 3 to 4 activities or more that you can kind of pull from. So this way, when the attention span starts to wane, you can kind of shift to something else. And, for the people that had mentioned the concerns around, trouble focusing, staying engaged, we want to think about is using that also as a here and now moment. If you're sitting there and the child clearly is having a hard time focusing, figuring out in a nice way, could you sort of explore that with them and look at what could they do in that moment to stay better focused. Because on some level, there's a good chance that if they're having issues with focus in that moment, they probably have those same issues at school and in other situations as well. So if you can work on it in a moment when it's occurring, you can then give them tools that they can use in other situations as well. The other thing I would think about too is it's also important to figure out, if you're used to doing stuff in person, how could you translate the general stuff, whether it's sort of play therapy or other kinds of things, into something virtual? Obviously, not everything translates super well, but a lot of things do. So thinking about, for example, if you do a lot with, I don't know, action figures or dolls or puppets or things like that, having the child or teen use whatever they have at home on their end, and then you can use whatever you have on your end. Okay, so in terms of some, practical ideas of what you can do. So in terms of playing games, so and again, for some of these, you probably want to get parental permission first. But if you're used to playing, I don't know, let's say Connect Four or Stratego or chess or some sort of board game in your office, there are some websites that have a lot of those games, at basically at online that you can play. Because the idea is if you're using that to help build rapport and kind of get a child or teen to open up without really thinking about it, if you can use games online that really don't require full focus, the idea then is they kind of play and then they start to open up and don't realize they're opening up. And then half the time you may stop playing the game because you're busy talking. But you can do that same kind of thing virtually. The other thing and this is something that gets at this idea of, combination of thinking about someone who has a hard time staying engaged and focused, but also brings up the idea of, can someone do something at the same time and still be focused? So obviously, if someone's there sitting there playing Fortnite, probably they're not going to be able to be fully engaged in your session. If there's a purpose for playing a game of some kind, because let's say it's really uncomfortable to talk about things, or it's just really hard to sort of just focus on talking. If it's something that's really tame, that really doesn't require a whole lot of focus, like the idea of just doodling, you can do that. For example, they could do it on a sheet of paper, or sometimes it's even better is to do it on a whiteboard on a screen, because then they're maintaining their visual attention, on you while they're drawing. And if it can be mindless, then presumably it's something they could do in other situations as well. Or, a tame game might be something like Tetris. It doesn't require a lot of, processing of information. They can sort of, and I would also say in a lot of these cases, having the child or teen do a screen share can be really helpful, because this way, it's not the kid's doing it behind your back, but the idea is you're fully aware of what they're doing and you've made an agreed upon plan on what they can do. Because I found that often works really well, is that for the kids, they feel like, oh, I want to do something else during the session, to have a discussion on it and make a plan. Because I think that's, just definitely really important. So, and another thing too, when you're thinking about how to keep kids engaged, is also think about the fact that, sometimes, and I imagine at this point in the presentation, we've been talking for a little while now, then I imagine, your attention may wane at least a little bit from the start. And so sometimes, having something unexpected a little bit can sometimes help a little bit in kind of getting your attention, and helping you to kind of rein in that focus. And so you can kind of do the same kind of thing, with your clients. So sometimes doing something a little bit unexpected can kind of get people's attention a little bit. I don't know if anyone has sort of closed out the video part, there's a little puppet on the screen at the moment. And so, this is one example of something I use sometimes with kids. I mean, in some cases, I'll use it with, it's more of like a play activity where they have an action figure or their own puppet or stuffed animal, and we do that. But, in other situations, it can also be a great way to get kids' attention when it looks like they've zoned out or aren't really focused. Because what happens is basically, the more you kind of gradually zone out, but then suddenly something like really unexpected, like gets your attention and kind of snaps you back into kind of focusing because of something new and different. Okay, I mean, other things that can be really helpful, and some of these things can also help you as a clinician to stay better focused and be more effective as well, is thinking about interactive things like a shared Google Doc. As long as it works with whatever privacy rules you have for your organization, or get something sort of equivalent. But one thing I do a lot with kids is basically we'll do a shared Google Doc. So sometimes we'll use it to write down strategies that we're talking about, and then they can sort of have the shared Google Doc to keep. I'll sometimes download it and send it to my portal after to kids and to their parents, if they have permission for the kids to do that. But the idea, or there are other things where maybe we play some sort of game where we look at thinking about, I don't know, if we're gonna or writing a story, or doing something that I'd probably do the same thing in person. But basically, the idea then is they're seeing it, and because they have to type and do stuff with it, it keeps them more engaged in the session, and it prevents them from being as likely to want to do other stuff during the session. Another thing can be helpful, and again, this is probably one of my favorite things in working with kids with ADHD, is the idea of there's this idea called harnessing fidgeting to improve focus. So it's the idea that, or actually, I'll give you an example. So if you think about a child who has a hard time sitting still, so they're shaking their legs a lot, they're fidgeting. Sort of sometimes I'll do an experiment where I'll see see if they're having a hard time sitting still. I'll see what it's like when I hand them an iPad and see, because usually in most cases, if they're engaged in a game on an iPad, they're going to sit still. And then I also do the same experiment with the fidget cube. And so basically, often to get somewhat similar results. But so the idea is basically, if someone's not truly interested in something enough that they can give it their full focus, if you add in movement, it can actually kind of help fill the gap to help people to be better focused. And so what you can do is, I've had, several kids I've worked with that have, gone out and got in like a, so like basically like a desk bike. These are, probably like $25 on Amazon. Basically, fold, so pretty easy to carry around. Basically, so kids can pedal during sessions. They also make an elliptical one that works really well. I've tried the Stairmaster one. That one, the Stairmaster one, I feel like didn't work quite as well sitting down. But certainly the elliptical and the bike one, at least I found, work quite well, because then the idea is they can pedal and it's mindless. Because any sort of fidgeting that you do, what I'm talking about, should be mindless. So for example, if I'm holding this, if I'm looking like this, even if I'm listening, I've lost the whole visual piece. But by it being mindless, so I'm squeezing this thing, we'll squeeze it down here so you can see it. If I'm squeezing this, I'm still devoting my full focus visually in front of you. So I'm not really losing any focus, and in turn maybe be able to focus better by having extra movement in. So, and these are things that certainly you can help kids to use during sessions, but think about how you could translate that into other things. So it's great that these things could work to help keep a child better focused, engaged during sessions, but could they then use those same strategies, let's say when they're doing homework, or when they're doing other tasks they have to do at home that involve sitting still that may be hard to do? So the idea really is about not just using strategies that help kids to just be engaged in sessions, but how can they naturally learn things from the sessions that they can then translate into day-to-day life? Because that's ultimately the goal. I mean, people are coming to you or logging into you to work on making things better in real life, not just to sort of function well during the session. Okay, so some other ideas for keeping organized or keeping engaged during sessions. Again, I mentioned the puppets, the action figures, things like that. Writing a story together could be helpful. And so there may be times where if, let's say, you have a kid who has a hard time, I don't know, with kind of going from one task to next. maybe having or organizing ideas. Maybe you could have them do research a little bit to think about, what could we do in terms of creating these characters? Because then thinking about how they organize information, you can use those strategies to work on preparing the story. And also by making it visual, it keeps them engaged. As I mentioned before, certainly you can write out notes yourself too of the strategies and share with clients, because then this way it also keeps you better focused. Like I do that a lot. I find it really helps me because this way I have, basically what I do, for example, is with people I work with, I have basically like a Google Doc that I use. And, as we go, I quickly jot down, whatever the topics are we covered. And then I have a list of tools. And so, when we talk about a strategy, I put that in. And then if we have an action plan, so let's say the client's going to, I don't know, work on, let's say, using the reminders app to, I don't know, put all of their chores in and make sure to mark off the tasks when they're done. So I would, we put that in, let's say, together as a task in the note. And then the reminders app is their main method for keeping track of what they're actually going to do. But then as a backup, the note's there to remind them of, what they plan to do, then so they can go back and check it. Because, one of the things also with working with people with ADHD and is working on the follow through. And so if we have a clear record of what did we talk about last time, what was your plan of what you're going to do, it makes it much easier to follow through on to check the progress. Whereas otherwise, it's my recollection of what did this client say they were going to do between now and next week, and what did the client say, and then that recollection of what actually happened. But some of it's also the idea of figuring out what but also like realizing sometimes by here now experiences what can work well for someone. Like, so for example, if you have a child or teen and you're working on trying to remember to do stuff, if you see how well they can remember something without writing it down, like, I don't know, like one example in this case would be maybe I would have a child, I don't know, bring a basketball to the next session or something to put in front of the computer. And so, some kids may very well remember that, but a lot won't. But then if we say, clearly it didn't look like this worked well to remember it, what if we look at a way to write it down? That then kind of gradually they're seeing the value in doing something because it didn't really work the way that they thought it would initially. Other things though, and focusing a little bit on keeping yourself engaged is, and again, these are helpful both for the client and for you. Think about how many web browser tabs a lot of people have open. So even if you're fully engaged whenever the session is, or even like think about attending this presentation now, if you have, I don't know, 8 to 10 or more web browser tabs open right now, if you go to find anything else, even if you're planning to stay fully engaged in the presentation, if you click on something and suddenly, I don't know, a news story pops up, like let's say you had, I don't know, CNN or NBC open or something, that's going to get your attention. Even if you don't like stay reading an article, there might be that thought in your mind of, oh, I didn't know that was occurring right now. So same thing with email. So if you're looking at email right now during the presentation, even if you're not going to respond to any of it, it's going to occupy some of your mind. So in the same way for kids, when they're doing sessions, if there's stuff popping up, if there's a text message, if there's a chat in Discord, whatever it is, if it's popping up, even if they're not going to do anything with it, it occupies some of their mind. It can make it hard to focus. So helping people to kind of simplify the visual presentation in front of them can really help a lot. Okay, so I thought it might be helpful to have a case example or two. So we'll have a 9-year-old boy. His presenting issues are ADHD and some emotion regulation challenges. So, some tools that might be used in this situation would be, interactive play with action figures and the puppets, to really have a back and forth dialogue. So maybe, so for example, maybe like let's say, I don't know, let's say there's a volcano coming. And so we'll call him Bert. So let's say Bert sees, oh no, there's a volcano. What should we do? And then let's say, I mean, I'll play too because I was not on the other end of the puppet at the moment, but the idea of, and then we have the monkey. And so the monkey says, I don't know what we should do, but I'm thinking maybe we can work together and make a plan and then work really hard to move all those rocks to block the volcano from erupting. I'm feeling very tense. How about you? Yeah, I'm feeling a little tense, but you know what I do? I take a few deep breaths in and out. In and out. In and out. I feel much better. So, I mean, the idea, obviously it's a little different than doing it with a child in the moment, but the point is that basically by doing some of the stuff you can really interact quite well even by video, and it really can keep especially younger kids really engaged, and then you kind of weave like a sort of lesson of what you're trying to focus on. So in that case, teaching the idea of taking a few deep breaths in and out can be one way to help calm yourself down. And so by kind of whereas if I in a lot of cases, I'm working with someone, I just said, maybe you should take 3 deep breaths in and out. I mean, some kids might try that, but mothers may say, oh, I don't, doesn't make sense to me. But by sort of weaving into the story, it becomes sort of a natural thing that kids then could see the value in, and then you could also then kind of after the fact illustrate it to them. Okay, so if we take sort of an older child as part of this, for someone who has a hard time keeping track of assignments, staying on task, getting work completed. So, one way I would work with someone like this, which I mean probably is probably the most common example of a lot of the kids I work with, is that I would have the child or teen basically do a screen share so I can see their online portal. Like my area, a lot of kids use Canvas or Schoology. So basically, I would see their assignments. We would look at how are they keeping track of the assignments. So, for example, if it's someone I'm just starting to work with, I might look at do they have a planner? Do they have an online task list they're using? Because when you think about keeping track of assignments, even for the online portals, if they put the assignments in there, it's a lot of information for someone to hold in their mind and plan. Because even if you see the list of assignments, for those of you that have seen a fair amount of these school portals, there's a lot of other information in there, and it's a lot to hold in your mind. So remember earlier that I mentioned about executive functioning skills, and one of those skill sets is memory and the ability to hold information in your mind. So with having to keep track of assignments, by having to sort of do a lot of playing in your head, even if you see the due dates for everything, it still can be overwhelming and a lot for someone to have to plan stuff out in their head as much. So that's where maybe figuring out a way to keep a task list or make a plan that's a little bit simpler than just here are all these assignments I could work on in the portal could be really helpful. So that's where kind of having a system when you're doing sessions with kids can be helpful with looking at the school portal and thinking about planning. And then you could use a whiteboard to have them write out stuff. You could have them create a plan in Google Doc. You could use a task list like Todoist, for example, or my homework app. And basically they could do a screen share, and then you could sort of see and work through all of it together. And then it helps them to plan. So they have a good plan of what to do. It also allows them to have a plan going forward of of how to do it themselves, and it keeps them engaged during sessions because they're doing something active instead of just talking about doing it. There are other times where playing an online game can be really helpful, especially if you need to build rapport. And the idea of picking a game that doesn't require a whole complete focus, and then using that to kind of get a conversation going. For some kids, if they have a real hard time, sort of not hitting buttons, and tend to, I would say probably at least maybe, I don't know, at least once every other day, someone I work with accidentally, hits the button to close out the session because they're moving their mouse to open up a new tab and something happens. So, it happens. But, the idea though is unless they need to be touching the computer, you can also have them sometimes take a step back from the computer. Or, in some cases with younger kids, I've had it where, the parent has sort of kept the keyboard out of reach, if we really don't need it for the session. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about executive function concerns and how to kind of manage some of them. Okay, so in terms of attention and focus, which is sort of under the umbrella of executive functioning, I mean, it's definitely crucial to it. Some people kind of consider that to be a central part, some kind of just kind of a connected one. But in any event, so the idea is if someone's having a hard time getting started on homework, why not work with them on that during the session? Obviously, your role as a therapist is not to be a tutor, but the idea is if someone's getting really stuck and because they're overwhelmed emotionally, or like a hard time maybe understanding directions, you could have them do a screen share, look at the assignment, and work on getting started. Like what I'll do with kids, for example, sometimes is, if they're really getting stuck, they can't figure out, oh, how do I start this paper? Or this college essay, I have no idea how to get started. Or I've been writing and I'm stuck. To look at it together, talk through it, process the feelings on it, and then work on actually getting unstuck with it. For things that maybe can't do it for an entire session, like there's a thing called the Pomodoro method, where it's the idea that people are only optimally focused for maybe 20, 25 minutes. So the idea basically is that you work for about 25 minutes and take a 5-minute break. And so you use an interval timer to do that. I mean, during a session, I'm probably not going to do that for 30 minutes of a session, but I've done that before in kind of a more controlled way. So I'm able to do it for 5 minutes and kind of practice a strategy like that to make it easier for them to use it on their own. Or sometimes what I'll do with kids and teens is basically, if we want to look at their process for what's going on when they're losing focus, I'll have them work for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, let's say on some sort of assignment, and they'll do a screen share so I can see it. And then what I do is basically while they're working, because I can see the whole screen, I take some notes myself on like what I noticed. So for example, I can remember, one particular teen I work with where basically anytime he had to go to a different tab to pull up information, he got himself distracted and then lost focus. Even though he was going to a tab that was related to the assignment, when he'd shift between two tabs, he got stuck. So one thing we realized could be done that would make it easier is to put the two tabs side by side so he's not constantly going back and forth between them, and that helped him to stay on task better. And in general, whether you're doing activity or not, oh, I must have hit something. Okay, there we go. So basically, the idea is even if you obviously lost focus, and I lost focus for a second that was not intentional as part of this, but sometimes when something happens unexpected, it can also throw you off in terms of focus. So the idea is if that happens during a session, figure out a nice way to see if you can draw attention to that with the child or teen, and help them to work through kind of processing what was going on. So for example, were they thinking, oh, I just want to get out of the session because I want to do my homework because I'm stressed, or I'm thinking about I'm really worried because I have a big baseball game later. So sometimes like using the here and now to figure out what's going on when they're having a hard time focusing even during the session can be really useful for clinical data that you can use to help you in terms of helping them more effectively going forward. Okay, so I'd mentioned the idea of harnessing fidgeting to improve focus before earlier, and again, certainly you can buy stuff like there's, on Amazon, there's packs for like 10-15 bucks of all sorts of different fidgets you can use, or obviously for the client to buy them if they're able to, but you can also use whatever is at home. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that you've bought. You can use a keychain, a ball of clay. Like the idea really is something that's going to be mindless. While I feel like a lot of fidgets for the right person can work well, there are some probably that are not the best. Like, so for example, the fidget spinner. That was one that I think was massively mismarketed for ADHD because essentially it's a toy, and because it requires a lot of focus to spin it, it's very distracting. I think it was designed in part for anxiety initially, which it takes your mind off of maybe what's bothering you, so that's helpful, but not necessarily to keep you better focused. I think even before the pandemic, I think I saw them on clearance like Bed Bath & Beyond or something. So I think it's a sign that, and I think at this point, I think they've been long banned by schools, most schools. So I think that the fidget spinner really is, I think, has been on its way out for a while. But I think you can certainly look at other ones that that are more discreet. Like, so for example, there's like this one that's kind of like a little, like almost looks like a video game controller. Hit a few buttons. It makes a little bit of noise, which isn't ideal, but if you're not that close to someone, or something like this, where it's a little closer. It's like a little, sort of like a little bead thing in it, and basically you can kind of just pull it up and down, but it's completely silent. And those are kind of the best ones because then this way they don't distract you or anyone else. It's also really important. And again, I mentioned the idea of the desk bike before, but or looking at even like a yoga ball chair, or sticking a pillow under your feet, just something to get a little bit of movement in. Or here's the thing: we've been talking all this time about the telehealth session, but there's also no obligation that the child or teen actually has to sit during the session. If you can set up the camera in a way, or they can set up the camera where they can be walking around or standing, that for some kids or teens that could work well. They could, for example, stand and use a balance board and then rock back and forth on balance board while they're talking to you. Or if they have good balance and want to do other stuff, they make things like a whirly board that you can kind of spin on. The point is there's all these different things. So whatever the child or teen even has at home naturally, you may be able to rig that up. Or thinking about even if you hook up a extra webcam, let's say, to a TV, they could do the session from a TV. So just again, the point is to really think outside the box. You don't have to be just in front of a computer in order to sort of have a video session. Is my point. Okay. So, the idea also is thinking about with emotion regulation. And again, you'll have the slides. So if we don't quite get to everything, you'll have access to slides. You can go back and look through it. But basically, for example, using like an app like Calmer Headspace, like one thing that can be really helpful is not just to say you can do this on your own, but to do a screen share of it during a session and show it to them. Because if they can access it, because if they can access it, that will, that will definitely be easier for them to pull, or because they can do it on their own. So basically, if you show it to them how to do it first, they're more likely to then go after and do it. Plus, also, if it's as long, I mean, Calm or Headspace is a little different because they require a subscription. But for anything that doesn't, if the child's allowed to download stuff themselves, you can have them download the app during the session, get it set up. Because if you say to them, "Oh, you should download this on your own," probably at least 8 or 9 times out of 10, they're probably not going to follow through on doing it. But it looks like there's a question on unlimited financial resources and smartphones. So I'll definitely get to that in a few minutes. We're going to start to wrap up soon to get to questions. I'll definitely, someone remind me, and we'll definitely, I'm happy to answer that question. Okay, so in terms of planning, again, just the basics of helping them to maybe have a task list where they can make a plan for completing assignments, and you could work with them on doing this during the session. So, like I mentioned before with the case example, you can certainly have them write it out, but the idea is really to help them to do stuff that they can then learn to do on their own. And you can even do this with a morning routine, because really getting them to think about what they're having trouble with. So if they're having a hard time with the morning or evening routine, think about what are all the tasks they have to do. So go step by step, thinking about from the time they get up, getting dressed, brushing teeth, eating breakfast, figuring out how long does that take. Because if the amount of time they have available is less than the amount of time it takes, it's clearly not going to work well to get out the door on time. And again, these are things you can do definitely in person or virtually. But the point is that, even with doing it virtually, you can even think about actually setting up some of the stuff. So maybe setting the alarm clock for the next day, putting the clothes out for the next day, especially if they're doing the session from their room. In terms of memory, being able to, really encourage them to write things down. And again, some of the stuff they can do a screen share of easily, some maybe they're not. But the idea is having the more they can do with this stuff during a session, it makes it far easier for them to execute it on their own. Whereas if you just say, "Oh, you should use a notes app," or "You should put some on a task list," and you don't set it up with them, they're far less likely to use it. And with stuff like a task list, a lot of the task list programs are free. So as long as they have access to a computer, you can use lots of stuff through Google, like Google Tasks, or the main version of Todoist is free. So a lot of this stuff, as long as you have access to an electronic device, with the internet access, really doesn't cost money separately to actually use. Okay, so in terms of breaking things down, in terms of tasks, I guess I mentioned this actually a minute ago. The idea of having them write out each step, because when you think about seeing it visually, that can for some people be really helpful rather than just talking about it. So especially for kids that are more visual, being able to see it all can help it to make far more sense than just talking about it. So I'll put that out there. That obviously you can do that in person too, but I think having a whiteboard or something visual in front of you when you're doing a virtual session can make it even easier to do that. Okay, let me just see how we are on time again. Okay. So in terms of one idea that can be really helpful in terms of practicing shifting between activities is to maybe make into a game where you pick a couple of things for the child or teen to get during the session. So maybe when you say go, they, I don't know, go get a pencil from the other room. They go get a piece of paper. They, I don't know, go get a kitchen fork. The idea is to kind of practice the idea of being able to think quickly, stop what they're doing, pause, and then go to the next activity. So again, you use whatever they have at home. Obviously, in this case, I'm not going to buy anything anyway for this, but the idea really is, using whatever someone has at home to be able to, make it into a game or activity that can be helpful in translating these skills into something else that they can use down the line on their own. Okay. So, there are definitely many benefits of telehealth treatment. Certainly, as we've talked about, there are some limitations as well. But really, I think really thinking about using the here and now moment is really helpful. And that also looking at that, because there are a lot of similarities between in-person and tele sessions, it's often more about the strategies you use that often matters than just if it's in-person or telehealth. So why do this? So we have actually about a little under 15 minutes left. I know there have been at least some questions, but why this? Why don't we go ahead and let's switch gears a little bit. Let's actually focus on the questions. And then, if there's time, I'll go back and do the case scenarios, but you have those in the slide. So let's talk about, I'm happy to start answering questions and sure we can kind of get to all of them.
Sure, Dr. Heller. So yeah, one of the recent questions that just came in, we can go over that one now, but just again, as a reminder to folks, Please feel free to share your questions via the chat box so we can get a chance to address them. One of the questions that came in, Dr. Heller, what are some examples of natural things that can be rigged up if families have limited resources? I know you just addressed that, but wondering if there's anything else that you'd like to add. I know telehealth has been utilized for a lot of individuals, right? Transportation, if it's an issue, we don't have to worry about those financial resources, but the fact that they're now on telehealth and the telehealth might require some other equipment, we still have those limited resources. Anything else that you might want to add for that?
I mean, on practical, and again, I don't know about every single school system, but I mean, in certain areas, schools give Chromebooks, as for being a student. So some kids may get access to an electronic device with a Chromebook, that has a camera on it just from sort of being a student. So that that may help in some ways with having access to a device. If a parent has a smartphone they're able to let the child use for the session, I mean, that's another option potentially. But I realize there's may only be unfortunately only so much that can be done around the getting access to a device in the first place. Plus, I also realize the other piece of that is having internet access.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's hard. I mean, in some cases, if there's a place where where someone gets sufficient privacy to sort of do it, on school grounds, if the school has Wi-Fi, that might be one option. But again, I realize it may be a little harder to sort of get such after school hours where you can sort of have a private space to do it. But I think if someone really needs the support to to talk to teachers or school staff and see what what could be helpful.
Great. Thank you. Another question that just came in. Do you see any difference between ADHD coaching and therapy in this approach?
Sure. One other thing I just want to add really fast to the other question though is the question about dealing, if kids are using their smartphone. I guess the question is, why do they have to hold the phone? Because you can sometimes prop up the phone in different ways. I mean, I have my cell phone, for example, propped up like in front of me right now so I can see the time. So the idea is, I mean, obviously they make stands you can buy, but even without paying for anything else, you can basically, stick a cup behind it and prop it up. So the idea is, people, even with the phone, there are ways to be able to put it down to use it.
Great. Thank you.
Welcome. All right. So the question on difference between ADHD coaching and therapy. That's a good question. I mean, it's sort of. I mean, I guess like often what I do is sort of a mix of, I guess, what I view as the two, but I sort of feel like it's under the same umbrella of here's an issue that I'm trying to help someone work through, and a lot of it becomes very practical, but it's also addressing sort of a lot using therapy tools as well as a lot of sort of practical coaching ones together. I mean, so again, it's hard considering there are a lot of people that do ADHD coaching or executive function coaching that are not mental health professionals. I don't actually know that many ones that are like myself that sort of, I'm sure there are I know a few others, but I think as far as I know, I don't think it's super common to kind of encompass both together. But I do think for the right person, it can be really helpful. I mean, there are also times where I'll work with someone just on the coaching piece, and while they continue to work with a therapist on other things, but just having the background, helps them then collaborate with that person. Or there are times where I'll do therapy and they have an executive function coach and I just kind of collaborate, but for a reason, this stuff that we want to work, it's not really feasible or doesn't make sense to kind of do it all together. So it's sort of hard to at least I find it hard to truly differentiate the two. But as far as the age goes, in terms of we could do it from, I mean, kids have a focus on, use executive function skills from the age of like 3 or 4 even. I mean, obviously you can, in each ways you could work on with really young kids, but probably I would say probably like school age, 5 or 6 is probably the youngest that I think would make sense to really start focusing on a profession, unless there's really like a serious issue from the start. And I find usually around like 3rd grade, based on just the curriculum in certain places, is where some of the executive function bands seem to be even more prominent in the school environment.
Yes, thank you for that. Another question, maybe just we can do one more, and then we can switch over to the case scenario, because I think I do want to I do appreciate, I want to thank you for sort of bringing in those props that you have and bringing these things to life for a lot of us. I think that has really been helpful to really be able to carry and think about how we can implement some of the things that you've suggested into the practice that folks are doing. So before moving on, using approved platforms, are there any suggestions that you might have for that?
Sure. You mean for video sessions?
Sure. Yeah, we can focus on those. Yes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, it depends sort of where you work and if they give you that what they give you, and make sure it's HIPAA compliant. I mean, I use Simple Practice, for example, which is connected to the electronic medical record system that I use, and it's HIPAA compliant and works very well because it's all integrated in one place. So when someone books an appointment, it automatically generates the link, so I don't have to do anything. There's Doxy.me that's, I think as long as you have a certain version, it's, HIPAA compliant. There's, I mean, if you have the HIPAA compliant, there's Zoom is HIPAA compliant if you have like the HIPAA compliant version of it. If you have, Google Business and you have the BA agreement through them, then I believe Google Meet is HIPAA compliant under that umbrella. So there's definitely a lot of platforms out there. Certainly some cost money. Doxy.me I believe is free. At least it used to be. I don't know if it still is, but at one point it's definitely free. So there's definitely options that are free out there that are HIPAA compliant. But I think that is an important part about making sure whatever you're using is HIPAA compliant.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we do have a few minutes left. Wondering if maybe you can go through the case scenario or parts of the case scenario just to again bring some of these concepts to life, and then we can revisit additional questions that folks have.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so we have Jack as a 14-year-old male who presented for treatment to address issues with ADHD and executive functioning that impedes his ability to stay focused at school and track homework assignments effectively, as well as get ready for school and get to bed on time. And he also has some challenges with emotion regulation. So we've talked about a lot of different things at this point in strategy. So what do you guys think? Let's use a chat box. What do you think? Why do you think telehealth might be helpful for him in terms of like picking that as the method as opposed to sort of an in-person session for him? Okay, so we have the time management difficulties. Right. So if he's having a hard time getting homework done, depending on where a session might be located, certainly would save him a lot of time, because if it takes him, let's say, 30 minutes each way to get to a therapy appointment, and then the time it takes to also mentally prepare to go back to homework, he could lose, on a certain night, he could lose, let's say probably two plus hours worth of time for a 45-minute session by the time he really gets situated to go work again. So that could also create more stress and make it even harder to get homework done. Right, and also the idea that you can, as someone mentioned, you can work on the homework in real time. So it's much easier because it's already set up. I mean, because one of the things that's really great about the video is if you're working with someone on homework-related stuff, as soon as the session's over, you can make sure they have a plan ready to go, and maybe even the last minute or two of the session, have them start the homework. So basically, you disconnect, and then they can ideally continue on with the homework because they're already in that mode. Because having to shift to start doing something can be really hard, but by having it already kind of preset and they're already in motion, can work to make it a lot easier for them to kind of get stuff done and stay on task. Okay, so obviously you guys have highlighted or covered some of these things here, but certainly if he's busy with activities, doesn't get home till late, that also makes it harder, because certainly a combination of trying to find someone that has appointments that hour, but even so, if he then doesn't get home till 8:30 or 9 from a therapy appointment, that makes it even harder to get work done and get to bed on time. Or we also, obviously there's not a lot of information in this then yet, but if he has other siblings, someone has to drive him to these things, whereas by having him already home, it's one less place his parents have to take him, so it can make it a lot easier logistically. Okay, so what treatment interventions or strategies do you think might be helpful in working with him? Feel free to put yourself in the chat box. Okay, so we have DBT, practicing motion regulation strategies. Yeah, so those would definitely be really helpful. Because I think also getting at the point that even though we're talking about the homework issue with homework assignment, there's certainly a piece of it that probably relates to being anxious about stuff. It's not all he just can't focus. And so I think looking at someone as a whole person is really important when you're approaching this stuff, and not because, again, like we've talked about a lot of practical strategies, but a big takeaway from like a treatment standpoint is it's not just about here's a strategy to use, but it's about helping someone figure out, is this a good, making sure it's a good strategy for them, and then also helping them really work on the follow through. Because for most of the issues, it's often harder to do it's harder to sort of follow through on stuff than it is to know what to do. And someone shared, looks like that they had someone or a 15-year-old do dishes while they were talking, help them to focus. So that's great. And again, I think being able to kind of use whatever, I mean, it helps them to get the dishes done, and it also give them a task to do to then be able to focus in. someone suggested medication. Right. And so medication certainly for a lot of people can work really well and be really helpful. It doesn't magically give you the executive function skills, but it can be very helpful in terms of improving focus and reducing hyperactivity and impulsivity. Someone suggested going through Canvas or checking the planner together. Great. I think it's definitely a really important strategy here. Someone suggested yoga and yeah, I think that would definitely be a great thing to look at. And again, you can also, you could help in this case, you could help Jack get situated in terms of even, making a plan of when he's going to do those things and putting it in his calendar or using the app to set a reminder for him. Because really, the more you can do to kind of make it as easy as possible for him to follow through on stuff on his own, that will help. Pictures can definitely be very helpful for different things in terms of visualizing what to do. I mean, certainly for younger kids, even having a checklist of if you need to remember what do you have to pack in your backpack. Sometimes taking a picture of everything and then basically looking at the picture against the backpack and then using that as a checklist to make sure everything's put in can be really helpful. Okay, so I know at least one or two people had commented about, we're almost done. At least one or two people had commented about concerns about using telehealth. Again, certainly I know some people, technology is a little more intuitive to than others, but, some of it's also opening up, for some of them, like doxy.me, for example, it's a web page. You basically open a computer, you open a web page, and you type in, I think, your name, and then you open it up. So for some of these, if there's a concern about it, just practice, just trying it out. Some of them I think are actually a lot simpler to open, than others. It's not a lot of steps, and some of them have only a couple of buttons. They're far simpler than Zoom. So I wouldn't let the concern about operating it stop you. I'd at least try it out and see if you can operate or learn how to do it. So I just wanted to thank everyone for participating today and coming. Definitely a lot of fun chatting about this. I hope it was helpful to all of you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Heller. So I know there was, this case scenario, there was a lot of information that was covered. And, as we're seeing some of these thank yous and great workshops and really good ideas to really help individuals with ADHD become engaged and all the more engaged and focused in sessions, I think was really great. These slides will be posted in the next 2 to 3 business days. So we do have the information there in terms of other suggestions for this case scenario. I did see that our CTEC host did put in a link for a survey. It will also pop up for you. But as I'm going through these slides, again, a lot of really useful information just to, again, bring to life the concepts that were covered by Dr. Heller. Resources. I know that we had the links embedded in the actual slides, but we also have an additional resource slide here. So again, thank you, Dr. Heller, for bringing these online games to our attention. So folks, again, you can download the slides. And again, 2 to 3 business days. We went through our Q&A, but as we wrap up, I do want to remind folks to visit our website and to join our future offerings. We have one next week on DBT, as someone suggested DBT as a possible intervention. And our new podcast episode was just released yesterday, so please be on the lookout for that. And then lastly, again, thank you, Dr. Heller, for a really informative and I want to say engaging presentation. I did appreciate for some of the folks sort of chimed in also. It helped to see the puppet and kind of become all the more engaged in your presentation. So thank you to you, and thank you to our audience for having joined today. Again, there is a feedback survey that will pop up. If not, there is a link in the chat box. Please fill it out. It does help us to inform future offerings. Please visit our website for any of the past trainings. And if you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to us at ctac.info@nyu.edu. And on behalf of CTEC and our presenter, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.